Hey guys, it is 2023, and one of my New Year's resolutions is to get rid of overfilled and bulging paper binders. I can't tell you just how sick I am of dealing with multiple regulatory binders. Paper is falling out of it. You have to open the binder and move everything aside just to get a new piece of paper filed. It becomes absolutely ridiculous. But what do you do if you're a site? Well, use Veeva Site Vault. Veeva connects patients, sites, and sponsors on a single technology ecosystem to make clinical trials easier and faster. Over 4,500 sites are using Site Vault. More than 400 industry sponsors are using Veeva clinical applications. It's pretty crazy. I didn't know that about 65% of global clinical trials run on Veeva. So there's already a ton of sites, sponsors, and trials on the system. If you're not using an e-regulatory platform, you need to check out Site Vault. It's completely free for sites to use. We're in the process of moving all of our studies over to Site Vault. The process is very simple, and it's making our lives and our coordinators' lives that much easier. To learn more about Veeva Site Vault, check out sites.veeva.com today. This episode is also brought to you by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research sites, site networks, sponsors, and CROs. Real-time systems allow users to manage complex clinical research processes with powerful, user-friendly interfaces that are revolutionizing how research gets done. Frankly, I wouldn't know how much money we're owed if it wasn't for Real-Time CTMS. It helps us track all of our study payments, ensure that we're invoicing on time, and I really have not worked with another company that has better customer service. So to get a free demo, check out the company's website. It is at realtime-ctms.com. All right, hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Welcome to 2023. We're kicking off with a great guest. Our guest this week is Shawn Blackburn. As CEO of YPrime, Shawn provides strategic leadership and direction. Since co-founding YPrime in 2006, Shawn's led the company growth from a two-person consulting firm to a global organization that focuses on evolving technologies to help accelerate development timelines, simplify process complexity, and improve data quality across the clinical development continuum. Shawn's got a very impressive background. He's been in the industry for quite some time. Prior to YPrime, he had a long career as a technology consultant for Cephalon and Parexel. While at Cephalon, he was instrumental in the company's development of applications to improve clinical trial workflow and provide deeper visibility into clinical trial performance. On a side note, I'm actually a big fan of YPrime's ePro system as a site user. So, make sure and check them out. This week we discuss clinical trial technology, the lack of flexibility of many tech vendors, and of course, decentralized clinical trials. So without further ado, Shawn Blackburn. All right, welcome to the show, Shawn Blackburn. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, Brad. How are you doing?
Not too bad. I still haven't had quite enough coffee yet, so I think it's a good day so far, but give me another hour or so and I can tell you.
Of course.
Where are you at? We were talking a little bit in the green room. You're in the Philly area?
Just out in the Philly suburbs, a town called Downingtown. We had an office, and we still have an office in Malvern, but it's basically a ghost town office now. It's it looks like the rapture happened there when you go through. You still have calendars set to March of 2020, so it's unfortunate. Big, beautiful building, but enjoy this area, and have lived here for over 30 years.
Nice. It sounds like you guys still have a lot of people working remotely then, is what you're saying?
Absolutely. So since the pandemic, we've probably we haven't hired based on living near an office.
Nice.
So I get the pleasure of meeting all our incoming new team members. So we have these calls called Meet the Founders every month as part of our onboarding. Myself and the other co-founder, Jamie Cook. It's an awesome forum. We get to meet everybody. But these days, it's getting people from Illinois, Texas, California, Europe, South America. It doesn't really matter anymore, which is great for recruiting talent because you can get the best talent and it doesn't have to be limited by proximity to going in and out of an office.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that. I mean, for us at the site level, I mean, there's not a lot of like remote opportunities. I mean, we're here, we got to see patients. So for the overwhelming majority of us, I mean, there's really no choice other than to be on site. And I know that across a lot of other industries, there's to like, debate about what's better, what employers want versus what employees want. But I have to imagine that, to your point, there's a lot of strength in the ability to, or if proximity is not an issue, you can really open the talent pool quite a bit.
You can, and you also have to think culturally different about your company, because you're not just employing the person anymore. You're actually establishing a relationship with their whole family potentially if they're working from home. I know my kids oftentimes walk into conference calls, say hello. They would say they're at school right now, but they'd be like, "Hi, Mr. Brad." So
Right.
everybody's on speakerphone. You really have to be considerate of how you treat people and how you talk to people, because everybody's hearing it. So I think it's a different world now. And certainly we have a logistics business that ships out devices. So obviously kind of similar to you can't really do that as well from home. But about, we're trying to figure it out. I think the future of the office space, it has to evolve to someplace you actually want to go and hang out with your peers. But for now, cubicle world, I don't think is really going to be used.
Sure. No, and I love that. But let's back up. I want to hit you with the question I always start everybody off with. I want to hear a little bit about what brought you to the clinical trial space. I think it's again always really fun. I, like a lot of people, came in like really by accident. So kind of give us a little bit of your origin story and kind of what kind of brought you into the clinical trial space, if you would.
So I think I was born entrepreneurial. I think I had a lawn cutting business when I was in high school, much like probably many young entrepreneurs, paper routes or lawn cutting. And then after high school, started college, but it wasn't really, I don't know, I was struggling to stay focused and wanted to be outside. So I ended up working in the construction business and taking night classes for my entire 20s. And then I realized after starting a landscaping business that I was going to people's houses to do work and getting there at 7 a.m. and they were leaving at 8. And so I'd see them before they left. I'd work all day there with my crew. And then at the end of the day, they'd be home. We'd still be working. And like, maybe I've got this wrong. I think I could do something different. So I went back to school for Oracle database programming boot camp at Penn State Great Valley in Malvern, Pennsylvania, and drive by there anytime I go to our office. It was like a 2-month program, all day intensive, and got a job right away in the IT sector. And then literally 4 months later, this was in 1999. So the whole Y2K era, if you remember that, IT budget through the roof. If you could fog a mirror, you could get a job in IT because everybody was just trying to transition into the brave new world of systems and infrastructures. And 4 months later, I switched jobs to a company called Fraser Williams, which had a clinical trial management system for big pharma. And it was this large monolithic Oracle backend database, client server, front end. And it was interesting. And so that's how I fell into clinical trials, is through the CTMS side of it, which I was fascinated with because you kind of see all the data, but nobody really cares about updating the CTMS. So it was an interesting system. It was massive. So you saw all this data, you saw all these different studies and everything that was going on. And I had fun kind of working in the back end of these systems for a while. But because because I came out of the blue collar kind of industry, I had a different perspective on appreciating what I was doing. I went from carrying, cinder blocks and trees and stuff like that to sitting at a desk and programming. So things didn't really bother me. It was like, this is easy.
Yeah, it sure beats laying sod.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So the company eventually got acquired by Perceptive, and
Mm-hmm.
ended up having an opportunity to install one of the systems at a biotech called Cephalon, which was also in the Malvern area in Pennsylvania. And it was a fast growing biotech at the time in 2003. And they were running, they had maybe 5 or 6 large clinical development programs. Their head of research, this gentleman, Dr. Paul Blake, ended up becoming a mentor of mine. But working under his organization, he had no idea who I was at the time. But he and my father had worked together at SmithKline Beecham in the 80s and 90s. And so I ran into him in the hallway and just introduced myself. And we became friends, and he ended up being on our board at YPrime much later. But listening to him and his passion about developing medicines kind of got me hooked. And seeing how it all fits together, when you work on the vendor side, you really don't understand how a clinical trial is run because you're just focused on your software. And you really, if you're like me, you're passionate about whatever you're doing. And if you're putting your heart and soul into day in and day out, and you think it's the center of your client's universe, I couldn't have been farther from the truth. When I went over to Cephalon, I realized nobody cared about the CTMS except for the people who installed it. And so myself and our other co-founder, Jamie Cook, we had this knack for just getting invited to all these clinical operations meetings, really helping them pull together all the data. And it was funny because we sat in all of them, we knew what every team was doing. And so when they would start talking about database locks or data transfers, we'd say, well, you better be careful because we think there's 3 that week, data management may have a problem helping you. And then they would all run off and figure it out. But so that's how I fell into it. And then after 3 years from 2003 to 2006 at Cephalon, actually Perceptive called Jamie and I up to see if we wanted to work on a large project for them. And they told us we should start a business. And they would contract to us, and we were like, okay. So we started YPrime, and they really never gave us any more projects. But we had made so many connections between working at Perceptive and working at Cephalon. As soon as people found out we had a business, they needed help doing integrations and different kind of system implementations or little add-on solutions. And eventually, after doing that for about 5 years, we started developing RTSM or IRT. I don't know what do you guys call it at the site? I've always wondered that.
Generally, I've called it IRT.
Okay, so we started developing IRT systems for INC research, and it ended up turning into a product of ours. And you read a lot of business books when you become an entrepreneur and you're trying to figure everything out. And I missed the one on how hard it is to go from a services company to a product company. And I always say we were just dumb enough to try just about everything in business and tech, and just smart enough to figure it out. And we were persistent as all get out. Like we just didn't give up no matter what happened. And I think because of Jamie also came out of the blue collar world. He worked for his dad's fence company in his 20s, and he knew that wasn't for him. And so both of us kind of had this realization in our 20s, like, I can't do this my whole life.
Right.
I want to get into more of the professional services world. And we both love building things. And essentially that's what we've done through both building a company and building solutions. That IRT product that we did ended up morphing into adding on ePro. And back in the, pre-2015 days, everything was custom. And we didn't know what we were doing. We went from one project to the next. So I look back, it's probably like looking back at your teenage years. It's like, I don't know how I'm still here today. I look back at the teenage years of YPrime's, business life and say, I don't know how we survived. We did a lot of custom work that we probably should have looked at a little differently, probably charged a lot more, probably restricted the customizations a lot more. Which led us to all these learnings about how to really build a product and build something that is configurable. And we're still learning today. Like, I think today the future of YPrime is more focused on the user experience for everybody involved. I think it's so interesting in unique in where we sell our products and services to a sponsor company, but people like yourself are the primary user, or the participants in the study are the primary user.
Right.
And, we don't get as much interaction as a normal, business to consumer or business to business relationship, because most of our interactions are with the sponsor. So I know that was a lot. It was 20 years of history in about 10 minutes, but that's how I fell into it.
Yeah, you distilled it well. No, I mean, it's interesting point you make, and that I see again and again. I mean, the sort of discrepancy between buyer and user, right? I mean, that seems to be the cause of a lot of problems in the tech that's used. I mean, what do you see as the solution there? I mean, is it just, I'm seeing more vendors become interested in, getting site opinions and,
Yes,
maybe,
I think that's it.
patient opinions as well. It's a really interesting dynamic, because I feel like, look, I'm not a patient. I'm not a, clinical trial patient, but I feel like when you talk about patients, sites are like right there beside them, right?
Mhm.
Like, no patient, we can talk about DCTs later, but no patient goes through a trial like on their own. They've got a site study coordinator right there with them. They are, we're advocating for them. We're trying to make it easy for them. We're oftentimes, just as involved in a lot of the things as they are. So yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic that I think maybe gets underappreciated at times, but I feel like it's becoming more acknowledged. I mean, do you think that's a true way forward to help sort of improve the experience for everyone?
I 100% agree that that is the way forward. Historically, the perception I always had, right or wrong, is that nobody's allowed to talk to the patients or sites, if you're involved in the clinical trial, because you don't want to bias or mess with the integrity of the data. I don't know if that's as true, or it was more urban legend type,
Well, I mean, look,
myths.
what you're saying is I think a pervasive thought that has created a lot of problems. And there was a time in my career where I felt the same way, even between sites. Like, sites don't want to talk to each other because we may bias each other, or we may give away some kind of competitive advantage, or yeah, I mean, I think that's probably still fairly pervasive, but again, I don't know that that's true. I do think you're right. It's sort of a urban legend's a good way to put it. I like that. I mean,
We've had the good fortune to add some board members to our team, and one in particular actually is on the board of sites, a couple of phase one sites, and so he's been a great help interfacing some of the challenges that sites feel to YPrime's product development teams. And then I've, over the last year, I've kind of said, you know what, I'm just going to go do it. And so getting connected with you is an effort for me to take information back to our team. I think it has to be more than just myself. Obviously, it has to, because I don't know everything about how the clinical trial is going to run. But the more people, the smart people on the technology side, on the project delivery side, that can establish some of those relationships, I think will be beneficial. I think the other challenge is everybody's so busy, right? We've got our blinders on. We're focused on meeting this next delivery milestone. For us, first patient in is a huge milestone, right? We got to get that system live. One of the things that I've always struggled with is UAT, right? And I'm sure you probably have never been asked to be in a UAT of a system that you're going to end up using.
yeah, no, not really.
And I'm sure you guys don't have time to spend 2 days looking at a system to help. But there has to be a better way for us to, because that's such an important part of software development, is that user acceptance, user involvement. And I think that's the thing we're challenging ourselves to figure out, is how can we do it in a way that's economically feasible, because we can't necessarily charge our customers. But I think we've done some recent projects where we interviewed thousands of patients on how they think a patient-reported outcome on a mobile phone should work. I think the other challenge is much like I think it was Henry Ford said that famous quote, if you ask people, what they want right now for transportation, they want a faster horse. So that's where you need some experts. And so we hired some folks that really know how to interview and not just say, take a look at this screen and how do you want us to enhance or evolve it? It's more of a conversation of here's other things that are possible. What do you think about these things? And then as well, understanding the psychology of kind of human factor research and how people just observe things visually and how intuition works now on devices, and that's going to evolve. That's going to continue to evolve as well. So we're definitely in deep, both feet deep in the water, and trying to build that relationship better. And we've always had the mantra: just it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. So I think we have to go and do our research and homework and create, the best experience for sites. And if we can do that, I'm sure it's going to be a much better experience for a patient or a participant.
No, I talk about that. We see that at the site level. We work with, I think right now we're working with at least 4 or 5 different ePro vendors. Some of them are just god awful. And I don't know that sponsors or even vendors appreciate that. Like if I've got 2 trials that are, maybe vaguely overlapping in some way, or, not competing necessarily, but I'm going to work on the trial that's got the easiest tech if I can. And I've used YPrime. I'm not saying this just because you're here, but I think it's a very good experience for us at the site level. I have very few problems with it. I can actually look at reports that are meaningful to me with only a click or two, instead of having to dig through all this crazy stuff the way that you do with some of the more popular or more famously well-known systems. I won't necessarily call anybody out, even though I love to do that. But frankly, when it comes down to it, I've seen this, a study that has bad e-pros or e-diaries, and I'm having to constantly apologize to patients, which the patients don't know. And that reflects on us as a site. If I hand them a crappy e-diary, that's a reflection on us as a site, because they're like, you guys screwed up. You don't know what you're doing. When in fact, we didn't set it up. We had no role or no involvement in that vendor. So again, I think those are maybe underappreciated things that can not just make sites' lives easier, but can truly affect the outcome of trials. You know what I mean? And again, I don't know that that's always apparent to sponsors and vendors.
Well, one of the things we're thinking about the future, and we did an acquisition earlier this year of a patient engagement e-consent platform. And I know e-consent is a little bit of a mixed bag of opinions, but the reason we really liked this company called Trial is they had this patented pending technology that was developed from consumer engagement models that their core founders had developed as part of a company that sold consumer engagement solutions into pro sports franchises and resorts. And so they looked at the problem a little differently. And so we're excited. Next year, we're going to start wrapping that stuff around the eCOA solutions. And so I think that's one step forward, but I don't think there's no magic bullet. I think ideally it's a never ending pursuit of just meeting with the end users and finding a way to do it, again, like I said, that is economically feasible, because I know you guys are busy all the time. It's a bit, clinical trials feel a little bit like the post office, that it just never stops. The data and the issues that you have to manage and work through just never stop happening. But that's business, right? I'm pretty sure that's every industry has to deal with that. And it's kind of the human dilemma, right? It's what we all get up in pursuit of working on something, right?
Yeah. No, that is true. And you mentioned e-consent. I mean, that's a really interesting one. And to your point, I think there's still, I don't know if there's mixed feelings or a little bit of debate about how e-consent, should evolve from paper consent. But beyond e-consent, I mean, what do you see as sort of the continuing future in ePro? I mean, what else is sort of on the horizon as we continue to, refine what that experience looks like for patients? I mean, what's on the horizon, I guess, in your mind?
A lot. And what can be adopted is going to be the key, right? And put into a clinical study. So anywhere from, really far out wearables, which are real-time monitoring, but the amount of data that's kind of passive data that is generating is immense. And so I don't think it's going to be possible to reconcile and pull all that together into submissions anytime soon.
Sure.
And so I think smarter people than I have to work with the regulators to figure out what types of, let's just call algorithms, could be validated in order to pull out the interesting parts of data anomalies as part of your research. So that's I think the real future state is more Star Trek wearing Dr. Spock, what's his name? It's not Spock. It's, my gosh, I'm getting old. I remember.
It's okay. I was never a Star Trek guy.
Yeah. He basically just put a device and it scanned you and told you everything you need to know, right? So
right.
I wouldn't be surprised if that is in our lifetime, but how does that get developed? Probably through clinical research. But in the near term, I think it's this hybrid world of touch points with the sites and the patients, and trying to do that in a way that is flexible and easy to use to collect those data points. But I think the real solutions we could start with today are really around engagement. And what I think is, and our team thinks, is it's something that it's interesting. On the sponsor side, I think the commercial side of the business would love to be engaging with patients and consumers full time. But they would ideally need to figure out how to do that in a way that's showing what research is upcoming. So imagine a world where sponsor ABC has a patient engagement solution that's just on in a particular therapeutic area that they're working in, and they're starting to build interest in the research community and patient advocacy groups and others of what's coming. And then when they get to protocol development, they've gotten feedback loops from sites and others about what's possible. They've developed a way to maybe more effectively allow you guys to conduct visits and apply the different procedures or assessments in a way that is just easier to do, potentially. Sometimes they're overly complex and you can't do them. Other times they're probably just right. Finding that just right spot, and then taking that data into a consenting process, whether it's paper or electronic. You want to build on each step. You don't want to go back and start from square one and it's like if you're filling out forms for something and then you got to go back to another form and start from the very beginning and put your name and address and everything again. That's what it feels like.
Right.
But it's bigger than that, I think, in clinical research because it's more data. So then there's this entering into the clinical trial or crossing over that wall. We call it the clinical wall between recruitment and then screening, right? So recruit, and then none of that data is taken with you forward. You got to start all over.
Right.
To me, that seems like the next phase where we could really apply things today. And it's more process and workflow and just technical services that connect with each other and allow us to not have to do the frustrating steps of repeat double data entry. And then once you get into the study, I think things are pretty, set. And if the systems connect, it'll be easier. But if they don't, it's going to be harder. And then supporting all this, I think every company really needs to look in the mirror and determine the best way to set up their help desk their customer care, the management side of the data, whether you call it data management or data services. That's something that we believe a lot and invested in building it in-house versus outsourcing. I know a lot of call centers in business are outsourced. We don't believe in that at all.
Oh man, it's a frustrating experience.
Yeah, so we've really invested a lot in that. And so I think, just once you get into a live study, participants with sites, that's actually the most important phase. I think we get caught up on go live and first patient in, and then it's kind of like maintenance mode.
You're on your own.
Yeah, it's really not maintenance mode. It's the most important part of your data generation.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, something you have picked on there that I find especially frustrating is that it feels like we operate like in a series of silos, right? And none of that stuff, it's just a series of closed loops where nothing is following along. And I can't imagine, I just have to imagine that we're missing so many efficiencies there by, to your point, kind of starting from scratch as patients get moved along we even see this at the site level. I can't tell you how many site information forms I've filled out for the same sponsor every single time we get a study. And I'm like, hey man, we have 6 studies with you. You already have a CDA. You already have a site information form. You already know everything you need to know about us. Why are we doing this all over again?
That's pretty bad.
Well, and again, I feel like those sorts of things are pervasive, not just from, to your point, not just from the site side, but from the patient's, perspective as well, which is just, I don't know, mind-boggling.
Yeah, those 5072s are fun, aren't they?
Oh, geez, don't.
Sorry.
Don't get me going. No, but I feel like there's a lot of interesting room for better patient engagement through ePro because again, it's still pretty closed. Like for us at the site level now, maybe that may be different. So, okay, if you look at something like ERT, Claria, whatever the hell they're called now, I can almost never find any valuable reporting in their system. It does not seem built for sites to gain any insight or meaningful data. It seems built for a sponsor,
Right.
as opposed to like with YPrime. If I want to know if a patient's, how are they doing in their screening period? Are they going to pass the eDiary portion? I mean, it's very easy for me to find that information, but it's not easy for me to sort of push to the patient or have any sort of patient engagement through these portals. I mean, is that something you see as a potential missed opportunity?
For sure. And the way I look at it is we were lucky because we weren't lucky. We were actually pretty smart. We have rebuilt our platform a number of times as we figured things out. We weren't scared to say, all right, let's start over. Let's build a new version really from scratch. It might take us a year or 18 months, but it's going to be a lot better for the users. Whereas I think a lot of companies are stuck with their technical debt and they're backed by private equity and they're big. They don't have the flexibility to do that. So we were lucky we were small enough to still be able to do that. But we've carried that tradition with us as we've gotten bigger. We're much larger now. And we're not afraid to say, hey, listen, let's redevelop it with some more modern things that we know are better today. So you describe systems you use. They're probably designed 15 years ago. And they were the design factors were basically taking paper and turning it into a screen.
Right.
And that was the main things they thought about then. But the world has changed vastly. I mean, social media really wasn't in existence 15 years ago when some of these systems were probably the basis of them were developed. Even some of the IRT systems are still based on phone system logic. So they have one item.
IVRS.
Yes, they have one item per screen. I mean, how annoying is that? Like we basically actually would challenge our sponsors and say, all right, in 2016 and 2017, they were still asking for us to create both an IWRS and an IVRS. And we would say, we looked at your last study. You had one call from one site in a whole 2 years. We're not doing it.
Right.
Like, it's so expensive. It's a waste of our time. And you don't want your system to look like a phone system, and you don't want your applications to look like paper. If you look at eCo and ePro, we're now to the point where everything doesn't have to be visible on the screen with the next button. You know what? Everybody in the world knows how to do their thumb scroll. Like everybody that's had a phone, your 3-year-old child to your grandparent, elderly grandparent, knows how to scroll,
right,
for the most part, and it's not that hard to teach. And so those are the things I think we have to think about today. And then, I've always tried to lead with empathy, and so we, try and coach our people, like, put yourself in the site shoes, put yourself in the participant shoes, put yourself in the sponsor's shoes, put yourself in the shoes of the other vendors we're integrating with. What is it that we would want to see if we were them? And that's how we've looked at it. So we'll keep doing that, and hopefully we'll get better and keep working with more sites directly to say, what is it you really want? I mean, what I'd like to also know from your perspective, where do you see the sites going in the next 10 years? Are you going to have opportunities to advance and evolve and apply new things? I know it's got to be difficult, but what are you thinking?
it's a really interesting question, and it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, and especially in terms of how much role sites should be taking in, like, building out their own tech stacks or bringing their own solutions to the table. And it's something I've been active in pursuing to some different degrees. Things like e-consent make a lot of sense for me as a site to own. It makes my life easier in a lot of ways. It makes us more efficient potentially as a site. Just good for business. Now, other things out there maybe don't make as much sense and are still unclear because, again, there's still so much disconnect between what sites and sponsors. It's I can't say, like, hey, I'm going to use MedRio even though your study's using Rave as the EDC. Like, I don't get to say that.
Right.
But if we have our own e-source, and maybe it's got APIs that can connect to whatever EDCs exist out there. Like, maybe that's a potential for the future.
Yeah. So then you only have one system to train your people on, and it just integrates.
Exactly. And again, those things are still unclear to me as a site. I know that I like to think of myself as very, forward thinking and sort of progressive, but I oftentimes fall into the trap of, like, well, sponsor's just going to tell me what to do anyway. I might as well wait and not waste my money for something that I may never get to actually implement, So I'm caught between that and the other side of being like, you know what? No, we're going to run things our way, and we're going to tell sponsors, hey, this is how we do it. Deal with it, And again, frankly, it's still unclear to me which side's going to win in my mind,
Yeah. What do you think about, like, the one thing that I've been thinking about lately is Norman Rockwell's paintings of doctors making house calls. Like,
Sure.
do you think you'd ever make house calls?
Absolutely. And I think even not necessarily house calls. My interest is in potentially making trips to treating physicians' offices who aren't PIs or sub-Is, but going to see patients in the clinics in which they're already being seen. To me, that's the sort of middle ground, right?
Yeah.
House calls, sure. If sponsors were like, you know what, you can go see a patient wherever they are, I would say, hell yeah. And I would invest in that as a site, because that's going to it's going to be good for me. It's going to be good for business. But I think there's still so much regulatory uncertainty. What's okay? What's not okay? I've tried to push some of these options to sponsors, and they seem like, we don't want to risk. We don't know. We don't like that. When does an office become a site? When does it need to be on a 1572? When does training and delegation need to take place? And I think some of those questions aren't clear enough yet. But at the end of the day, me as a site owner, I'd say, hell yeah, let's go do it, because it's just going to give us that much more reach,
I don't think our podcast is long enough to talk about the ideas that I have about that. So
it's okay. We can schedule another one. But I think those are extremely interesting questions, especially in light of, the whole DCT movement, if you want to call it that, where if you listen in to some of these DCT conversations, you would think like you can just go do anything anywhere now. And that's just not the case yet at this point. It's
Really?
it's not true,
You can't ask for forgiveness?
Well, you can ask for it once as a site. If FDA comes in and says, cool, here's your 483, you can't do any more research, then you're done.
Yeah.
Or if the sponsor says, especially a big sponsor, I mean, if you're working with a Pfizer or an Abbott or AbbVie or whatever, you don't want to burn that bridge. And they say, oh, we're throwing your data out because we don't like what you did. So I think it's a fine line. I do think sites need to be willing to push the envelope, but at the same time, have some assurance that they're not going to dig their own grave either.
I think we all have more power to speak up than we give ourselves credit for in the ecosystem, right? I think good ideas can come from anywhere, but they can't just be the DCT movement, like you said, is an interesting one to watch. I think the ideas are interesting and some are good and others probably aren't going to work out how they're being publicized. But I think it's all tech and no thought about people and process. It's like, oh, just use technology. It's what new was it you that posted the picture of the, e-techie thing of the week that sites are supposed to now use and that's not going to be available next week. And
right. Yeah. No, it was not me, but I did see that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's how it feels from our end. To be honest, we've been doing decentralized trials for 20 years in certain ways. So it's not new. It's not like all of a sudden, but I think some companies are actually taking advantage of what happened during the pandemic and saying that that's the future when I don't think that is anywhere near what's going to happen. In fact, I think some of those companies are going to be in big trouble.
Oh, yeah.
When other directions are taken that make more sense.
Well, and you can, again, if you ask a site, we can confirm that. I mean, yeah, a lot of things changed very quickly during the pandemic, but almost as soon as humanly possible as they could go back to the way they were, they did.
And that's big pharma and sponsors are heading in that direction.
So that's where, you see no going back. And I'm like, oh, well, I mean, cool. That's a good sentiment. But I mean, frankly, we are going back. Monitors are back on site as soon as humanly possible. Patients were back in clinic as soon as humanly possible. And we didn't hang on to a lot of that. And then to your other point, I mean, I would agree with you that if collecting data through ePro, when a patient's at home, that's decentral. Would you not call that, an aspect of decentralized trials?
Exactly.
I mean, we do that. We know that. And I think we don't have to necessarily take that to the extreme limit of like, oh, well, now everything happens at home and a nurse is going to go to your house and your drug's going to get shipped to your home. And now a doctor isn't even hardly involved anymore. It's a weird line and I struggle with it between convenience and science. At what point does it become bad science?
Exactly. I think that's right. So we look at the data collection components as the core tech, right? And then all this DC stuff that's being pitched to solve all of life's problems is convenience technologies, but they're not taking into account the core data collection technologies. And frankly, some of those companies scare me because they could put a bad image on our industry. If it doesn't work out for them, it's going to look bad for a lot of people. And the level of scrutiny and the new forms that we're going to have to fill out and the audits that are going to be created out of something bad, that's what always happens in business and human civilizations. Something happens that then they, now they have to put new laws in place to protect it from ever happening again. When it shouldn't have happened in the first place because it was just bad science or bad business practices. But 3% of the population will ruin it for 97% of the population.
Right. Yeah. No, that is true, unfortunately.
Yes.
Well, all right, Shawn, I know we could go on forever and I may have you back to discuss some of these things we only got to lightly touch on, but where can people find you online?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Shawn Blackburn, CEO of YPrime. Our website is www. The letter Y and the word prime altogether.com. So happy to connect with anybody.
Very cool. Anything else before we sign off?
I really appreciate your time and contributing. It wasn't a one-way conversation. I think that's the way these things are enjoyable for everybody. So I really appreciate you doing this in the industry and bringing a lot of smart minds on your show.
Least I can do. I appreciate that. All right. I appreciate your time, Shawn. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad.
As always, thank you so much for listening to the Note to File podcast. Make sure to check us out at notetofilepodcast.com for episode transcripts, show notes, and guest contact information. Also, make sure to keep an eye out for our live streams and come join in the conversation. Thanks again, guys.